Good evening, viewers. Thank you for your interest in gender dignity, unique and equal, and I'm your host, Matthew Francis. As you know, 2016 has been a tremendous year for awareness, and awareness has not translated into acceptance. It is still June, and our violence has increased 60%, over 60% already. A disturbing statistic that I read recently is that 1 in 10 trans folks will be killed by being beaten to death in their lifetime. That's what they can look forward to, so to speak. I have found this to be such an emergency. Many of you are aware of what happened in Orlando with the massacre, and what some of you might not be aware of is that 3 weeks prior to that, there was also a massacre in Mexico where 15 lives were taken in a similar fashion. There are a plethora of issues going on. We have issues of homophobia and transphobia, gun issues, poverty, all kinds of evils that go along with poverty. And tonight I'm very excited. I have Quinn with me. She is a tremendous advocate for this community in Maine. We're filming from Maine right now. She has extensive credentials, which I will allow her to introduce them herself. Tonight we're going to do a little bit different. The first part of this program, we're going to hear Quinn's personal story and also her professional credits. And then Quinn has agreed to sort of give the viewers a tutorial, a cultural tutorial. And that will include probably some terminology, good questions to ask a trans person if for the first time you're meeting one, and just some things that you should be aware of. We're aware of the fact that if you're watching this program, then you're an ally, and I'm very appreciative of that. I want you to be aware there's sort of an ethos in our culture at this time. I feel that violence is just gone crazy. I guess it really hit me a few weeks back. I was reading about Vermont. A Vermont trans man had been beaten to death. And then something that affected me profoundly was Dr. James Dobson, who has stepped up to the plate. He's a prolific spiritual teacher in the Christian community, and he has literally said, be a real man and kill a transgender person in the bathroom. I was just devastated. In fact, leveled enough that I literally called a lawyer to see if he could get in any kind of trouble for inciting violence. This has just gotten out of control and want to address that. And so the third part of the program, Quinn and I are going to address issues of poverty and privilege. In hopes that we can just come to an understanding and be safe and decent with each other and inclusive with each other. So I'm really excited where this program's going. It's transitioning. We're not doing such lighter subjects. We're getting a little bit deeper, unpacking more and more issues. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into allowing Quinn to run this. Quinn, please, if you don't mind, start off a bit about your personal life, if you're willing to include your transition story, and please use language and talk in a way that feels safe and comfortable for you.
Okay, well, Matthew, thank you so much for having me on here tonight. So my name is Quinn Gormley, and I'm a trans community organizer here in the state of Maine. And I live in Portland now, but I think most of the relevant parts of my life story happened before I moved to Portland. So I grew up in Damascotta, Maine, which is, it's in the mid-coast region. It's this pretty small, not as isolated as other parts of the state, but I like to say it's on the edge of nowhere.
Sure.
And so Damascotta is this tiny little retirement community that's also a tourist town and a fishing town. We're pretty famous for our oysters, and we're right near Pemaquid Light. And my parents moved there right after I was born, and so that's where I've lived most of my life. And so I think that's, as a trans person, a pretty interesting perspective, because I had the opportunity or the privilege or maybe the inconvenience, depending on what day of the week it is, of being the first trans person to come out in my community in a really visible way. And also before coming out as trans, as coming out as a gay man originally. So I did that really at the beginning of high school. I came out as gay, and I was the class gay kid for a couple of years at this high school with fewer than 400 people at the time. And that was an adventure. That was back in the mid-2000s, and yeah, that was an exhausting experience, because I was really, there were certainly other queer kids at the school that I went to, but it wasn't really something that was talked about and it wasn't conversational. And although there were queer kids and like some people knew that they were queer, they didn't talk about it, they didn't name it themselves, and they certainly wouldn't try to date anyone, or they wouldn't do anything publicly within the school, because the administration was pretty adversarial at that point. So coming out as gay, I remember the first time, I came out on a Friday afternoon to a whole lot of people in school, and this was just as, we had just done, you can tell how old I am, we had just switched over from MySpace being the most popular social media platform to Facebook. And so I came out on Facebook, and it was before you could stop everything from updating to everyone. So when I changed my sexual orientation, the 100 friends that I had at that point all got a notification about it. And I remember thinking, okay, well, I have a weekend for people to figure this out. And so I go into school, and I started my school days there with band practice every day, and that was fine because my teacher there was also queer, and she was one of the people who had, I think, made it really possible for me to come out at that point. And having her as a role model and as someone who I knew I could go to and find refuge in her classroom was something that I knew would make it possible for me to come out. Which is why having openly queer and trans teachers is really important. We don't have enough of them in this state. But right after that, I had gym class. And so I go up and I walk down these creepy cement stairs into the basement of the main building at this school to go to the men's locker room. And I get in there and I walk over to my locker and I'm changing, and this other kid comes up and he tells me that I don't belong in there anymore. And then he shoves me up against a locker, and then a couple of other guys come along, and I got beaten up pretty well, and I run out of the locker room and I kind of skip out on gym class. I skipped out on a lot of gym class, which shows a little bit in my life now. But that was really this first moment where I knew in a really visceral way that I needed to be afraid in this tiny little town that I grew up in. And so as a year or two went by, and I'd already had an understanding of myself as trans. I'd known I was trans for a long time. That's kind of this trope that we get into in our community where, well, you're only a true trans if you've known, since you were 3 years old. And I'm one of the people who's known that, but I know that that's not a narrative that fits a whole lot of people in our community, and that I want to make sure that that's clear to our viewers tonight. But it is true for me, and so I'd come out as gay as really this, because I thought that it would give me this license to be different. I mean, I'd already been different. I got beat up a lot in middle school too, but I figured if I came out as gay, no one would expect me to live up to these ideals of masculinity anymore, and that was somewhat true. And so I started coming out as trans, kind of midway through high school, and I got involved. We heard about this endocrinologist down in Portland, and we went down and we saw him, and I was one of his first 5 or 10 patients, I guess, that he was treating as a minor. And so I got, I don't want to go too much into the details of how hormone therapy worked, because it changes every 6 months at this point now anyway. I also just don't think it matters. But I got involved down there, and I've been a patient there for, I guess, 6 or 7 years now. And as a side note, I was one of their first 5 to 10 patients. They now have over 120 from around the state of Maine, which is really exciting. Yeah. So, and I started on that, and I dealt with my family. I got really lucky. I also had a social worker in the school who was queer, who acted as my therapist for a couple of years, and she was really a phenomenal advocate for me. And so that kind of went on. I never went to my school and said, you need to change my name already. I never went to my school and said, I want a different bathroom. I didn't want to fight because I'd already been hurt so much at that point that I made the decision, I just want to get through this. Yeah. And I work with a lot of queer youth now, and even ones who go to that school, which is now, the thing I like to say, I joined the GSA, which only had straight kids in it my freshman year of high school, and there were 6 people in there. And by the time I left, there were 56, and it was the largest student organization in the school, which goes to say when you have the privilege of coming out and when you have supportive teachers and social workers, those kind of programs can really change a school climate. And that's certainly what I'm hearing from the students who are there nowadays, that it's certainly far from perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than where it was when I was first coming out. So anyway, as it turns out, that music classroom was really important to me. And so I spent a lot of time there over the course of my high school career, and I decided to go to conservatory to study music. And so I had this idea that I had to leave Damariscotta because I was alone. I was completely and utterly alone in Damariscotta, Maine. There was no community there, so there were certainly some, it's one of the, demographically speaking, one of the oldest parts of the country. And so, you know, being a young person feels pretty lonely to begin with, and being a young person who's different, there's not a lot of hope to find camaraderie. So I decided I'm going to move to a big city, and I'm going to move as far away as possible so that no one I know from my current life will bump into me. So I went to actually a small Christian school outside of Chicago called Elmhurst College, that it's affiliated with the United Church of Christ, which, you know, midway through my high school, my local UCC church, the Congregational Church, as we usually call them in New England, went through a process to become what we call an open and affirming congregation, which is to say that they at least say on paper that they believe that LGBTQ people are valid children of God who should be loved and respected. The extent to which they live up to that is a different matter. But then I went out to a UCC school in the hopes of being able to transition, in the hopes of this being a progressive school where I could be safe. And they accepted me I got my acceptance letter particularly quickly. And I had said in my application, also you can date me, the applications were still on paper. But I got this, I left a note in my application saying, by the way, I'm trans, and when I get to school, I'm planning on transitioning, and like, we should talk about that, because I didn't think it was reasonable for me to hide it, because I didn't think I'd be able to. So I got this really enthusiastic letter from the president of the college, and from their dean of admissions, and all of these like big administrative people saying, oh my God, we want you, we're such a queer accepting school, come here, we'll make it work. So I moved to Chicago. My family drives me the 22 hours it takes to drive out there, and I get to the school assuming that I'm not really sure what's going to happen in terms of housing, but I get there and I find out that I've been assigned to, I get a double room to myself with a private bathroom. And on the first day, I'm like, wow, I think any college student would love that. It's right next to the kitchen and everything. It's on the first floor, and it was a walk up, so that was nice because of all the gym classes I didn't take. But and I got there and I'm like, okay, great. I get to be here and try and be myself. And my family was trying to be supportive at that point. But I'm attempting to make this move from living in Hodunk, Damariscotta, Maine, where you know, the average age is over 40, and where racial diversity barely exists, and living in the whitest state in the country at the time, to Chicago, which is a Midwestern view on the world, which is it was right between the suburbs and the city itself. So I had, you know, this fast-paced city life and this suburban horror.
Well, that's quite a bit of transitions.
So it was. So I had that going on. I had the leaving my parents going on, and I was trying to change genders, and so that went miserably. Particularly because at that point I really didn't have any sort of passing privilege, and so I was getting clocked, which is what we call it when someone can read you as being trans.
Gotcha.
And passing privilege is what we call it when you get read as the gender that you are. So it was a pretty miserable first day, and I got a lot of stares and some threats, and I knew pretty quick that I was not going to have a good time. So I half ran back into the closet, but it was college, and it was a progressive college, and even though I found out by day 2 that I was in fact their first trans student, which was really disheartening to have to do that again. That at least there was a large lesbian and gay community, and so I got to join up with that, and I had a little bit more license to be myself. But I dropped out after about 6 months because you know, as a young trans person, I was vulnerable to a lot of mental health issues, which is something that we see way too much of in our community. And I was dealing with those, and I needed to deal with those in an environment where I had supportive friends, and I never found that out there. So I came back to Damariscotta, Maine, and to discover that my parents had outed me as being trans, which is something we had talked about them not telling anyone about this, because I didn't envision myself coming back for more than a couple days at a time. But I was out. I was dealing with my hometown, and there were a lot of people who were enthusiastic to be supportive, even if they didn't know how to be supportive, which is something that we're finding more and more of as trans people become visible, is that there are people who want to be supportive, they just have no idea how, and they frequently do it pretty badly, but they're trying at least.
Yes.
Which is progress. And some people who are not very happy about it. I remember one of the first days of spring, the year after I came back, that I was walking down Main Street, and I was wearing this lovely sundress. It was my first sundress. I wear them every day now. And I'm just walking down the street by the library that I basically grew up in, and this old man spits on my face. And it was this other reminder that I'd built myself up into this couple of months of mostly positive things going on that, right, even though I had changed, my hometown hadn't changed very much, and so it still wasn't very safe.
Can I interject? So
Yeah.
here it is. I mean, you grew up with these people.
Yeah.
They knew you. And this is so off-putting to them. I mean, they're abusing you.
Absolutely. And I want to make it clear, there were also a lot of people in my corner.
Sure.
And those people are how I got through that.
Yeah.
So I decided I didn't have the means to get away. I wasn't in a position of mental health
Yeah.
to go back to school yet. So I decided there was this place that I'd grown up hearing about just down the road in Bristol called the Carpenter's Boat Shop.
Okay.
And I heard that they specialized in taking people who are in a period of transition, and they basically give them a place to live for a year. Okay. And while you're there for a year, you learn the trade of building traditional wooden boats, small wooden boats. And so I applied to be there, and their new director happened to be a queer minister, and she was one of the first people I came out to. I came out to her on Easter on our way to a church service, and she welcomed me in. And I found, for this 1 year, this incredibly safe place to be. But it was kind of funny because this is also where I was going through the bulk of my transition, and hormones were starting to take effect, and I was growing my hair out at that time, and I was trying to figure out how to present as myself in an environment where I had to wear Carhartts every day and I was covered in sawdust all the time. And so I get this funny thing where we're trans women in our community come up to me like, Quinn, can you talk to me about fashion? And I'd be like, well, no, because I learned how to do all of this in a shop.
Yeah.
So we're lucky that I'm not covered in paint today. Maybe not from my perspective lucky. I think I would be happier like that. But one of the things that I got exposed to, though, while I was at the boat shop is Kim, the director, found the website of this organization called the Main Transgender Network. Mm-hmm. And she said, they have a support group down in Portland. It's only about an hour and a half drive. I'll take you. And so we went down. My sibling decided to come down with us as well. And it was at the University of Southern Maine in a classroom on some evening. And I was terrified. Mm-hmm. And I walked into this room about 2 minutes after it started to find that it wasn't starting for another 5 minutes because our community is not very punctual. But I go in and I sit down, and I am on the verge of tears. And then the facilitator at the time goes up and he closes the door and he comes over and he starts the meeting. And this weird feeling of safety came over me. And I'd never felt that before.
I was going to say, that's really peculiar. It was so foreign to you.
Yeah. And it was this amazing change in the tenor of my life. And at the end of the meeting, I had talked about myself, which is not something that I was comfortable doing. And I had talked about how hard it fucking was living in a fishing town at that point while being trans and being terrified every time I had to step off this campus to go, to the dump or go fill up gas in the truck or something. And for that hour and a half, I was safe and accepted and among my own people. And I came out and I said to Kim, I got to come back. And so 2 weeks later, I came back, and 2 weeks after that, I came back. And 4 years after the fact, now I'm on the board of directors and I facilitate that meeting. And it's because I learned really quickly that community became my refuge. And as I dealt with the struggles of being isolated in a state as spread out as ours, as rural as ours, that those meetings were what kept me alive week to week. And that is still so much the case of what we see now. And as I got more drawn in there, I started getting exposed to these other resources. And so when my time at the boat shop was over, because they only give you a certain amount of time there, I wanted to do something. And so I have always had an interest in politics, and so I asked some friends who I met there who are pretty big donors to the boat job. That's how I know them. And I asked them, can you introduce me to someone? I know that you're involved in the local political scene. It was the 2014 elections. Can you introduce me to someone who can let me, volunteer in a campaign for a couple of months? I had the privilege of being able to live with my parents at the time and them being able to support me. I thought Shauna Bellows was running, and I was like, Shauna Bellows is amazing, because she was like the candidate for Maine State Senate running against Susan Collins, and she was saying all these things that I was thinking against this senator who gets this credit for being bipartisan when she was supporting the Tea Party at the time. And I thought I was going to work in her campaign, but they sent me in the direction of this other organization called the Maine People's Alliance.
Yep.
That they thought that they knew the regional organizer, and they said, we can't vouch for this campaign, but we can vouch for the Maine People's Alliance as a place that's going to give you an opportunity and a place that you're going to be safe in. Mm-hmm. And so I started volunteering there, and I was going to do a day a week, and then I did 2 days a week, and then pretty short in proper campaign fashion, I was doing 7 days a week. And at the end of the campaign, our region in 2014, we lost pretty hard on the progressive side of things, and this region I was in was the only region that won our competitive races in the entire state. And that was a real high. And I decided I want to get more involved. And so they offered me an internship. And I came down to Portland to start going to USM, and I had this internship, and I was spending all of my time doing this political work. And at that time, we were just starting the process of doing a people's referendum to raise the minimum wage in Maine, which of course we're about to have the last couple of months of that campaign happen now. And I was getting more involved in Maine Transnet, and all of this was happening at the same time. And suddenly my life had gone from being isolated to being everywhere very quickly. And one opportunity after the other kept coming on, because once people notice that, well, you're willing to do this stuff, they start giving you more to do and more to do. And eventually, after about a year of that, it turned into an actual paying job with an organization called the Health Equity Alliance, which is the largest LGBTQ organization in the state that you've probably never heard of. We're pretty quiet about it. But we work with 3 populations. So we work with LGBTQ people, we work with people living with HIV, and we work with people who use drugs, mostly injection drugs, and we do a lot of harm reduction work around that. So this year, for example, if you've heard about these Narcan or naloxone bills, that was all us. Okay. And so I have this job now where I get to get paid to do the organizing and political work that the Maine People's Alliance trained me to do, but I get to do it in the context of working as a board member of Maine Transnet or working with the Health Equity Alliance, where I get to apply these political and community organizing skills to filling this void in our community where, I talk about how we're rich in artists and we're rich in really good cooks, I found, but we're really poor in politicians and lawyers and doctors, and so I get to advocate largely in the healthcare system to have our community have more people who know how to do this so that we're stronger and healthier.
And something that just hits me, and I just want to interject that, is that when you weren't getting the support, you had all these mental health issues and really unable to function. And then when you got the support, look at what you're accomplishing.
Absolutely.
And I find that's true of almost everyone, trans folks. When they're getting the support they need, they flourish. So
I think that's a really good point, because I was still dealing with mental health stuff as I was getting involved, but the more involved I got, the more addicted to work I got. Sure. Granted, and my fiance can vouch for the fact that I'm really bad at putting down my laptop at the end of the day and
so workaholism is a drug of choice.
There are certainly worse ones, or more dangerous ones, I might say. But yeah, every time I had another opportunity, and every time I got to be more in this community that has become my family in many ways, and even those who aren't my family living in Portland, which, in the scale of things is still a tiny city, but, for someone who grew up in the country, it's still, pretty overwhelming some days still. But the trans community here is pretty large, and so even if they're not my family, it's become this small town that I live in on the streets of Portland. And that level of support and meeting someone who I could fall in love with, which just is something that I think trans women frequently don't think we're ever going to find because we're so incredibly stigmatized as a group, has made it so that I get up every morning with a desire of being able to help others rather than waking up in the morning hoping that I can get to the end of the day. And that's an incredibly radical thing to have happen in such a short period of time.
There's a difference between living and coping. Yes.
Absolutely.
Wow. There's a lot there. And there's some stuff I'm going to come back to. And so what I'm hoping for now is you've actually kind of incorporated some of that. Would you mind giving viewers a bit more of your professional credits?
Absolutely. So I guess just to list a couple, my primary day job, I work for the Health Equity Alliance.
Yep.
We go by HEAL, Health Equity Alliance. And within that job, I'm the Central Maine Community Outreach Coordinator. So what that means is I cover 9 counties spanning from the bottom of Oxford County, touching New Hampshire, all the way up to Jackman and out into the mid-coasts. And so that includes all of that broadly rural region, as well as the cities of Lewiston and Auburn and Augusta and Waterville and Skowhegan. So I'm all over the place. I drive about 2,000 miles a month. And in that job, I have 3 functions. So one, I provide a traveling, free, rapid, and confidential HIV testing and hepatitis C testing service. So I test folks.
That's huge.
Most of them, what we call men who have sex with men. So that's gay and bisexual and queer men. And I don't like that this is how it's defined, but this is how the Federal Center for Disease Control defines it. That also includes transgender women who have sex with men.
Okay.
And so I test them for HIV and hepatitis C and connect them to other STD testing and other healthcare opportunities.
Wonderful.
So that's a third of the job. Another third of the job is I work with medical providers' offices and hospitals to train them on cultural competency, which I think we might talk about tonight.
Yep.
So I train them on how to work with the patients that they already have who are trans, who are queer, who are living with HIV. And I give them the basic set of skills to basically treat their patients like humans, which is hard in a setting as complicated as a hospital, and it's really hard to keep up with that. So we do that with lots of doctors' offices. And then the third part of my job, which is probably my favorite part of my job, is I get to provide institutional support and community organizing skills in our community. So I plan pride festivals, I talk to community nonprofits, and I talk to them about trainings that we can help them offer. I talk to them about, people I think might be a good fit in their organization who could, maybe provide them with financial skills, which is something that a lot of community nonprofits don't have, and I can make recommendations on, and they get, more sustainable every time that they have a broader set of skills. Wonderful. Making them move forward. So it's a really wonderful job. And then I serve on the board of Maine Transnet, where I do money is actually my job. And I facilitate a lot of meetings and do a lot of programs. And I also I got involved in politics. I chair the LGBTQ caucus for the Maine Young Democrats.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So as we can see, that Quinn is more than qualified, because the next part that she's willing to do is she's going to give cultural competence with the idea of the average viewer is an ally, with the premise though that they maybe has never met officially in person, to the best of their knowledge, a trans person. So we're going to come at it with this idea that human nature is curious. And sometimes our curiosity can get the better of us and make us ask questions that are really maybe not the best questions. So with that an idea that the people you're addressing are not medical professionals per se, they're just sort of average people watching this program, wanting to be supportive, would you mind introducing some terminology and some cultural awareness?
Absolutely. So the first thing I want to make sure that you all understand is, even if you don't know that you've met a trans person,
you probably have.
You have met a trans person. I can guarantee it. Where we make up, the estimates, and they're really crappy estimates because we don't have good data in our community, between 0.3 to about 3% of the population. So that is probably, if you live in a town of 1,000, at least one person.
Absolutely. And I know, Quinn, because of the show even, in Maine in particular, I can't speak for other parts of the country, but for Maine, there's a lot of us out there who are living stealth, and that's a term you'll probably address, living stealth, who are somewhat scared to death some of this awareness, that they'll be found out. So yeah, you probably have met a trans person. More than likely they're passing, and that's why a person might not know they were trans. But so yes, I'm sorry. Go right into some terminology.
Absolutely. So, well, do you want me to start with terminology or maybe some don'ts?
No, I was actually thinking, because actually even the term queer is very confusing for people.
Absolutely.
And like stealth and passing. So yeah, maybe some terms first and then some.
Absolutely. Well, I think queer is a great place to start because I know when I toss around the word queer, when I go up to Damariscotta now, everyone cringes a little bit because for a lot of folks, especially folks, over the age of 40 usually, they remember when that term was derogatory.
Yeah.
And even within the broader LGBTQ community, there are some elders who still are uncomfortable with that term, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But as a young person, queer is often the word that we choose to use because we don't like calling ourselves lesbian or gay or bisexual or trans because, queer is more ambiguous.
Well, queer in that term, isn't it sort of an umbrella? Like it just means an affiliation with the community rather by gender or sexuality?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So, and it's a reclaimed term. It started getting reclaimed in the 90s. And so it's definitely a word that is okay for queer people to use.
Sure.
If you're unsure about how to use it, you can say LGBTQ.
Yep.
And that's fine.
Yep.
And the best practice there would be to, if you're talking to someone who's calling themselves queer, you can reflect that back to them in language. But in general, defaulting to LGBTQ is probably the best practice.
And can't queer, though, be used for some people as a gender identity?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so go into that maybe.
So within the trans community, in the media, we see people who were what we call assigned male at birth. So when they came out of someone's, when they were born, they were put into the male box, but who now identify as female, or we see people who were put in the female box and who now identify as male. And more what we have found, and we are about to have some really, really fabulous data from the US Trans Survey get released about this, is that about a third of the trans community nationally doesn't fit into either of those boxes. Right. And so they're what we call non-binary people. So they don't fit into that gender binary of male and female, which is, we take male and female and we define them as being masculine and feminine, and they're the opposite of each other. And they're supposed to fit together somehow, which I've never discovered very well. But these non-binary people don't fit into that. And so they might be in between it, or they might define their gender in a way that goes completely
outside of
in a different way of defining, and so male and female aren't useful terms to them. And within non-binary people, a lot of them would identify as queer or genderqueer, and so that's where that comes from. And so the best practice there, if someone's describing their gender as being queer, if it's relevant to your life, ask them what that means, because it's such an intentionally nebulous term that you can't really understand someone's gender simply off of that, and they might not want to talk to you about it, and that's perfectly fine. Right. So, so I think queer is a good place to start. I also think that talking about what does trans mean is probably really important. So I think that the term transgender is confusing to a lot of people because it gets lumped in at the ends of lesbian, gay, and bisexual, and so there's an assumption that because those other three are all sexual orientations, that transgender must be a sexual orientation, when it's actually a gender identity. And so I think maybe why don't we talk about how those are different. So sexual orientation is really about who you are physically attracted to. And so that describes the gender of the partners that you either have or that you desire. And we can also talk about romantic orientation, which is even a newer term that's talking about your emotional orientation in the world. So who do you want to, say, share a life with? What's their gender? Those words help you describe that. Then we have gender identity, which is describing this internal sense of self that is unrelated to biology. And I think that's a really important point. It's unrelated to biology, and the biology is also not always well defined. And then we have gender expression, which is how are we presenting our gender to the world? And a really great example of showing the difference between gender expression and gender identity is I'd like to talk about my fiance. Her name's Hannah. She and I, we both identify as being women. And yet I wear a dress almost every day of the year because I think that parents are stupid and uncomfortable. And I had to fight fucking hard to be able to wear a dress, and so I'm going to wear one every day. And I would be described as being pretty feminine in my presentation. My partner Hannah, she likes to wear a suit and sneakers every single day, or jeans and a sweatshirt, and she would be described as having a pretty butch presentation. And so our expressions of our gender are divergent, arguably, but our gender identities are the same. To put it in perhaps a more crass way, and I think that this sometimes clears it up, sexual orientation is about who you want to go to bed with. Gender identity is about who you want to go to bed as. Gender expression are the clothes you're taking off to get into bed. And romantic orientation is about who you want to wake up next to the next day.
Right.
So I hope that clears things up.
I hope that clears it up too. And can we maybe cover stealth and passing?
We'll get there in just a sec.
Okay.
So, and I was trying to define trans.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Kind of got off on a tangent here, I'm sorry. So someone who's transgender, that's describing someone whose gender identity, that innate sense of self, is different than the one that they were assigned at birth.
Right.
So, and that's all that trans is. So it's a really broad umbrella term as well. And so when someone says that they're trans, you don't really know what that necessarily says about their current gender or what their history with gender is.
Right.
And to go along with trans, we now have this term cisgender. And so cisgender is kind of the parallel to the term straight that goes with gay. And so cisgender is someone who is cisgender is someone whose gender identity is the same as the one that they were assigned at birth. Yeah, and so the reason why we use the word cisgender now is because, it used to be, well, you're either trans or you're normal. And if we go back 20 years, you were either gay or you were normal, and now we start saying straight because we know that being gay is also normal.
Right.
And so now we say cisgender is just
Different variation.
It's a different way of having a gender, and that's perfectly fine.
Yep.
So a lot of trans people go through this process that we call transition. And transition is also, all these terms are really broad, and I think that's important to know. They don't have really specific meanings.
Right.
But transition is this process by which you go from living in the gender that you were assigned to living as yourself. And for some people, transition is a long list of checkboxes of things that they want done to themselves. And for other people, transition is this complicated, long process. But for most people, transition can consist of a legal component, like changing someone's name, like changing your gender markers, which sometimes we jokingly talk about the legal component as being the trans tax because all of that's really expensive. And you should ask me about that later.
I will.
There is an internal component, a psychological component of coming to understand yourself and how you relate to the world. There's a social and cultural component, which has to do with how are you relating to the world? How are your relationships with your family, with your partner, with your kids, with your coworkers? How is all of that changing as your gender is being perceived as being different around you? And then the part that gets all the attention in the media is we have the medical transition.
The medical, right.
And that, for some people, involves hormone therapies, that involves potentially surgeries, and just some basic terms. When we talk about surgeries, we don't want to say sex change anymore.
Right.
We don't even want to say sexual reassignment surgery, so we talk about
affirmation,
gender affirmations or gender confirming surgeries, and we talk about those as to approximately where in the body they occur. So if it's below the belt, we talk about bottom surgery, and if it's in the chest area, we talk about top surgery. And so again, if someone tells you that they've had bottom or top surgery, there's a whole bunch of possible surgeries they could have had, and frankly, you probably shouldn't be asking them.
That's a good thing to not be asking.
So, because I mean, as a trans person who lives out all the time, so I talked about being trans professionally, so I don't really have the ability to be stealth, which is when you kind of hide your trans status, and that's oftentimes a safety concern, which I know my plan was always to be stealth if I ever had to come back to Maine, because I was terrified, and I'm terrified everywhere now when I read the news, but for some people, being stealth is just a more authentic way of being themselves because their trans status might not be very important to their gender identity.
And it's not necessary to have to tell the world. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Because business isn't really.
Really, yeah.
But with surgeries, one of the reasons why we're not asking, you don't want to ask someone about a surgery is, how rude is that? I mean, when you're asking someone, have you had the surgery yet? I get asked that all the time. My response is usually, well, no, I still have my appendix. But no, I mean, really what you're asking with that question is, what does someone's genitalia look like?
Right.
Which you wouldn't walk up to a stranger and ask them what their genitalia looks like.
Anyone, period.
Yeah. And I get that question at least once a month now, if not more often, and it's just obscene. Why is it anyone's business?
It's just not culturally, appropriate question to be asking. Yeah.
The only people in your life who have any even vague right to know what your genitalia is like is someone with whom you have a sexual relationship, and even then, you're in charge of when that gets talked about.
And that's a real safety issue too. So
absolutely, and that's actually, if we want to talk about murders, that particular situation is what a lot of murders get started from. So, so Don't ask about surgeries. So transition, I guess broadly, as we were talking about, is this complicated process that has all of these parts in it. And something that I really like to emphasize is, for trans people, transition is not most of our lives.
Right.
There's no specific timeline, but anecdotally, I'd say it usually takes about 2 to 5 years for most folks. And then they go on living their lives. Not to mention, they've led a whole life before that. And their gender identity was valid before transition, it's valid during transition, it's valid after transition.
Yes.
And most of the trans people you're going to encounter in your life have already done this.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, really important to know. Especially when I talk in a medical setting, I know what I want to emphasize with doctors is you don't actually need to talk to every single one of your trans patients about what are their goals with transition, because most of your trans patients have already met their goals with transition, or it's not possible to meet their goals because of some class reasons that we'll get into. Is there any other things that you'd like me to go into tonight?
Could you, instead of telling viewers maybe not what to ask, what would be good questions to ask? Fair, reasonable, curious questions.
Absolutely. And I think I'm going to frame this around kind of the coming out process. Because I think that this is where most people kind of get into the weeds, is when someone in their life is coming out to them for the first time as being trans. And to say coming out, by the way, is when someone is disclosing their trans status to you. And so I come out every day, but I'm talking about the first time someone's coming out, usually towards the beginning of their transition process.
Scary.
Yeah, it's terrifying, and also a place where violence happens a lot. So I think, particularly given the light of, the Pulse nightclub massacre in Orlando a couple weeks ago, the thing that I want folks to ask trans people first is, what can I do to support you?
Yeah.
There is such a huge mental health disparity in our community. The statistic that gets me out of bed in the morning and keeps me doing this work is that 41%, so about 4 in 10 people who are trans will attempt suicide in their life.
And how many more that we really don't know, because they were successful in their suicide and we had no idea they were struggling with this. So
Absolutely.
There's,
Or who came close to doing it and then, stopped.
Yeah.
So it's a huge issue, and about the U.S. trans survey that's coming out soon is going to show us that on any given day, a third of trans people in our country are experiencing significant, measured by the fact that it has a large impact on their life, significant psychological distress.
Yeah.
So you need to ask the trans people in your life you love how they're doing on a regular basis and how you can support them, because at the end of the day, they're just a person going through a difficult time. And transition, especially the early parts of transition, is frequently one of the most vulnerable couple of years in a trans person's life.
And I know this is true, not just personally, but just because of talking to so many members of our community, rejection is huge. And I think, showing your support and your concern is just absolutely vital, just vital, life-saving, literally. Yeah.
And I think to go along with that, I think rejection is a great point. So something that we have in our community as kind of an aspect of our culture is this idea of a chosen family. And so I have a loving family with 2 supportive parents. I have a sibling I'm close to. But then I have this whole other family that I spend probably a lot more time with, who are frankly just as important to me. And so something that I want the allies of my life to ask me when they're trying to figure out how to support me is to ask, who are the other people in my life supporting me? Because if you want to give support, knowing who else is in that network is really important, and it's going to make your support more effective.
Exactly.
Because if someone's struggling with a relationship with a parent or with a partner, but they have a really good friend across town or 100 miles away who they can rely on, knowing that if this person's in trouble and you need help helping them, going to that person who's more able to support them is going to be important.
Absolutely.
I think the next question is, which is frequently where a lot of people struggle, is what do we call them? What do you call this person who's sitting with you or on the phone with you, who's coming out to you? What name should we be using? What is the name that they are claiming for themselves now? And what pronouns should we be using? And I would also just add that we should be asking a lot more people, not just trans people, what pronouns they should be using.
Yeah, just as a matter of course.
Yeah, because you don't really know. But asking what pronouns, and then certainly you get a grace period where you get to practice on using them, but
sure.
getting those rights is
It's imperative.
and I wouldn't even say that's part of allyship. I'd say getting pronouns and name correct is a prerequisite for allyship.
Yeah.
So those are the two first questions that I usually recommend starting with. And then the last question, I think that this is also dependent on the relationship that you have with the person, is what changes should we be expecting in your life?
Yeah.
And I emphasize, you might get an answer that's about medical transition, about, well, I'm starting on hormones and I'm getting surgery. But more likely what you're going to get is well, this is changing my relationship with my partner in this way, or, we're going to figure out what to do with the kids, or my parents and I are struggling with this right now, so I'm going to go stay with a friend for a while, and I want you to know that. So the changes that happen in trans people's lives around coming out tends to be much more, common than people would assume. It's it's family difficulties, it's changes in relationships, or it might be, if you say that you're their employer, it might be, well, I would like to use this bathroom now, and I need to make sure that that's okay. And I'm going to start wearing a different set of clothes, or I'm going to need a new uniform. And so the really tangible things like that might also be
just
in there.
nice concrete things. Would you mind, I think that was a pretty comprehensive tutorial.
Absolutely.
And, just because I really want to address this. I know you think you're an old lady here, but I'm going to tell you, I got 20 years on you, I think. I would love to get into maybe start off with some grim statistics of our community, which is a really unfortunate way, and talk about poverty and some of those statistics and how they play out. And then if we do have time, I would love to launch into a bit of privilege and what it's been like. I might even share a little bit what it's been like for me to go 42 years as a woman and then switch as a male, and the privilege I've seen, and then perhaps you as well can address that. But I'm gonna give it to you to take up some of the poverty issues that really impact our community.
Absolutely. So we did a study last summer among a couple of organizations to try and get a really, really basic snapshot of the economic conditions for trans people in the state of Maine. And I'm not going to say that this was the best study ever, because we had almost no funding, but it gave us a really basic snapshot of what the statistics are. And what that study showed us is that about 50%, so about half of trans people in the state of Maine, are living below the federal poverty line. And about 2/3 are living at a point where, self-reported, they do not make enough income to meet their basic needs. And we define that as having 4 components to it. So being able to have food in your stomach and in your family's stomach, being able to access healthcare, being able to have a roof over your head, and being able to have transportation to some sort of job. And so 2/3 of trans people in Maine can't do all 4 of those at the same time.
Wow. Now, and does this at all reflective of the large, throughout the United States, or we're just sticking with Maine for now?
So compared to the larger United States, that's pretty much what we expect.
Okay.
Yeah. So in fact, if anything, Maine might even be slightly lower than the national average.
Right. Because I know food insecurity in Maine is really huge.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we are one of the poorest states in the country.
Yes, we are.
So, but yeah, this would suggest to us that trans people are among the most economically vulnerable populations in Maine, and that our rate of poverty is similar to that of people of color in Maine. And this is a statistic that I like to have Mainers hear on a more regular basis, is that Maine has the highest rate of poverty among people of color in the United States.
Wow.
And that's also about 1 in 2 people of color.
Okay.
And so that's definitely related to the fact that we're also the whitest state in the country.
Yes, we are.
So yeah, it's a really dire situation.
Now, I'm going to launch off even more. Drug abuse, mental illness, sex work. Can we touch on some of that?
Absolutely. So it's going to sound odd. So, sex work is actually a policy area of mine that I really like to study. So some of the data that we have shows that about 11 to 12% of trans people will participate either in sex work or survival sex. And I want to make sure that we're clear on how those are different.
Yeah, okay.
Sex work is where someone is choosing, possibly because it's the best option for their circumstance, but they have the autonomy to make the choice to do the work of providing a sexual service. Survival sex is where circumstance and coercion meet, so that is the only way that someone, or the only really reasonable way that someone is able to get something that they consider essential to their being. So that might be a roof to sleep under, that might be food in their stomach, or that might also be accessing a substance that they're dealing with. And so we don't know what the breakdown between those is yet. Hopefully we'll have some new data on that soon. But basically about 1 in 10 trans people doing that in the course of their lifetime, and that being particularly true for youth, and that being particularly true for trans women, especially trans women of color.
Sure.
In fact, with trans women of color, that statistic goes up significantly.
Just exponentially. Yeah.
And that's talking about these layered oppressions and these intersecting identities that people have, is making them more vulnerable to being in a situation where sex work might be the best option for them, or where survival sex becomes essential for them.
And in my mind, there's not really a choice. It's sort of like, perhaps it could be, like you said, there's some autonomy, it's a lucrative option, but I'll be honest, Quinn, I studied this myself. I've not met one person who ever really genuinely wanted to do this as a life course. And part of the reason I will maintain that is a couple things. When you ask them if this is what they want for their children or someone they love, it's always no. And I've never met a child yet who aspires to do sex work for a living. So in my mind, this is usually it's a last resort.
Yeah, and that's a very common perception, and certainly sexual abuse within sex work and within survival sex is common. I work with people in my job because I test folks for HIV, and so sex workers is a population that I encounter on about a weekly basis. Okay. I know that there are people in Maine who choose this as a profession because in Maine it's pretty lucrative. But when we talk about the ethics around sex work, the model that we use now, it's a triangle. And on one tip of the triangle, we have personal autonomy, or choice is usually how we say it. On one of the triangle, we talk about coercion. So someone forcing you, or some factor forcing you. And then the other end of the triangle, we talk about circumstance. So just where are you in the world right now? And so I would agree, I think for most people, they're not going to be all the way over at that tip where they have 100% choice in the matter, but those people do exist. And regardless of where someone is on that triangle, they certainly don't deserve to be stigmatized for
Absolutely
it.
Not. Yeah, absolutely not.
So we see sex work a lot, and I see it a lot among trans youth in the state of Maine. And that ties very closely in with another statistic that keeps me up at night, which is that the most conservative estimates, and I think it's far higher, suggests that about half, or frankly probably closer to 60% of trans people will experience sexual assault in their lifetime.
Oh, absolutely. And you're right, it probably is significantly higher.
So it's really an epidemic at this point, and it's an epidemic in our society as a whole, but trans people are uniquely prone to it. And I want to make clear that statistic is true regardless of current gender identity. So trans men are just as likely as trans women, or just as likely as non-binary folk. And we know from studies of the long-term impacts of sexual assault and abuse that has a huge impact on earning potential down the road, because as it turns out, dealing with trauma makes it harder to get through the day, and that lowers your ability to get a job.
And also something I think people don't even think about is that once that has happened, it almost sets you up to be re-victimized repetitively.
Absolutely.
That's not uncommon.
In fact, the data shows that, and in my little free time I have, I volunteer on a rape crisis line. What we know is that once someone has been assaulted, that their chances of being assaulted again go up about 5 times.
See, that's what so
because predators can smell it on you.
I believe that. I think energetically we put out things, and they have their feelers out there, and predators prey because that's what they do, and they pretend. So unfortunately, I think we didn't get into everything we wanted. I'm going to have you back, I think.
I'd be happy to.
Because we never did get to really get into privilege and some of our lived experiences, and it looks like our time is wrapping up a bit. But tonight, you just got a tremendous tutorial about a decent way to approach people who are gender diverse and transgender. And you met Quinn, you heard her personal story. We've gotten into some really overwhelming statistics. I'm going to wrap this up with the idea, I think of rejection, that for some reason is just really on my heart. I think of all the violence that's happening, and I think of the shooters. I'm thinking of the shooters. I'm thinking of people committing the violence. I'm thinking people who are victims of violence. And something that always seems to be in common to me is that they're not connected to a community. And they often, before they go on these violent acts, are rejected. And what occurs to me, trans folks are very much rejected. And if you feel the need to reject a person, a trans person, any person for that matter, do that decently as well. And the reason I'm saying that is, I think when a person is rejected, I mean, that hurts. But when it's not done well, it compounds the pain. And you're likely to have just a really primitive response that it's such a painful thing. I think of a couple things that come to mind. A friend of mine had a breakup the other day, and he was broken up via text. I know someone else had a 4-year relationship, and she was broken up with literally on the phone for a couple minutes. Why am I bringing that in? Because the rejection it just goes on, and it gets compounded and compounded, and we would like it to stop. So if you're watching this program, I'm very grateful to you, and I thank you that you're really wanting to help people be safe. You're wanting to help people be included and being decent. So I thank you tonight for watching the show, and we'll see you again next month. Thanks so much.